Without communism, China over the last 100 years would be a much simpler country. If it wasn't for communism, the Tiananmen Square massacre would likely have never happened. The death of thousands, the introduction to a new era. This protest was one of the most impactful events of the 80s. To understand Tiananmen Square, you should start at the Chinese Civil War. Beginning 1927, the two political sides known as the Kuomintang and the Republic of China got in a feud that would last over 20 years. The Kuomintang, led by Chiang Kai-shek, would battle for the belief that China should reject political beliefs and remain dynasty-ruled. Though the opposing side would come out victorious, and since 1949, China has been communist. This immediately transformed China into a politically dominated country. This process of change was known as the Cultural Revolution. Led by Mao Zedong, the new beliefs were quickly spread around China using propaganda and the youth.
I was in the middle school when the Cultural Revolution started. I was totally pour my energy, even my life, into it to support whatever Mao asked me to do. We thought he was a god.
Mao had a group of goons known as the Gang of Four who would go out on the front lines and move the country into Mao's vision. One change was that now everything that went in and out of China was moderated and filtered by the CCP. The CCP, or the Chinese Communist Party, was in charge of their revolution. While the process might be looking good from the outside, the Chinese people were suffering immensely. Apart from the fact that the whole thing was being framed as nothing more than a slight revamping, a huge wealth gap was forming, sparking hunger and poverty. Essentially, communism was only communism when it benefited the powerful. People were living under fear of the Gang of Four and the CCP, as simply thinking about opposition could get you imprisoned or killed. With the World Wars concluding and the Cold War beginning, tension was at an all-time high and the Chinese citizens could barely get a word of anything. In 1986, Chinese astrophysicist Fang Lizhi started an activist group that would give tours of Chinese universities attempting to expose the truth of Chinese life. Through subtle commentary in his books and the propaganda through his tours, the CCP began to pick up on his movements. Deng Xiaoping, the current chairman of the Republic of China, would comment on how Fang's ideas were praising the Western world. In 2013, Fang would publish a book titled The Most Wanted Man in China, addressing his history of scandals. The first big step the protesters made was building a statue. This monument took 4 days to build, was made of papier-mâché, and titled Goddess of Democracy. It was erected in, you guessed it, Tiananmen Square. It would be sadly removed and destroyed 5 days later by the CCP. Soon enough, word of public protest was caught by the government. Martial law was then announced in Beijing. On May 15th, the students of Peking University announced a hunger strike. They were demanding political reform. However, the government was not urgent to react. There were 3 things that directly caused the famous protests in Tiananmen Square. For one, the introduction of common technology. The average household now had a computer to look up anything that the government allowed. People began to discover an alternate timeline. They learned about the Western world. They wanted the American dream. They longed for something more in life than what the CCP allowed. The second reason was the death of Hu Yaobang. Hu was 73 and the leader of the CCP until a heart attack took his life on April 15th. He was well known for his more down-to-earth political approach. He pushed the idea of facts over propaganda, and many people respected him for that. However, there was also a large population of China that supported the Cultural Revolution and the methods used to achieve it. This is because they believed that China would fall without a controlling government. The first group would march down the streets of Beijing to demand Hu be replaced with a more democratic leader. The second group would join the first, but only to commemorate Hu's contributions to their protests. Nevertheless, the two sides could set aside their differences and march for the betterment of their country. Hu had been transformed into a martyr, his death marking the end of tyranny. Now, many people mistake this march for the Tiananmen Square March. However, that march was a week or so later, and much less peaceful. And now for the final spark. For no reason at all, on the night of June 3rd, a government official ran through a crowd of people with a jeep, killing 3 and injuring 1. The surprise is that this man received no repercussions. This was the final straw for the students. Here we are, 8 p.m., June 3rd. The students of Peking University led thousands of Beijing citizens throughout the streets, marching slowly to Tiananmen Square. They were demanding democracy, changes in their economy, and their freedom of speech. There is a misconception that the students did absolutely nothing wrong and were unrightfully gunned down by the big bad military. This is the furthest from true you could get. People were ripping up sidewalks, lighting fires, and assaulting police. People would attack policemen, rip off their uniform, then put it on and act like they were a policeman, shouting things like, "I'm so privileged I've never even tied my own shoes," or I sure hope they put more propaganda in my mail this week. The people were increasing their numbers by the second. The military was instructed to block off Tiananmen Square with their tanker trucks and other vehicles. The idea was A, to make sure no more people joined in on the protests, and B, to keep the crowd exactly where they were until commotion died down. The CCP was also broadcasting on the radio to not join in on the protest. By this point, shots began being fired, and the students did not back down. Due to the buzz, ambulances could not reach the wounded. People had to literally be run to hospitals on stretchers, which of course were already packed with injured protesters. As a result of this, dozens of dead bodies had to be tragically piled into the underground subway system in order to continue. Many of the protesters began crossing Zhanghao Bridge, but the military was sent off to block the other side. When people grew in violence, the infamous tanks were rolled into the square, crushing many protesters and leaving many in shock. After over 20 hours, the government finally got the people to retreat home. Thus began the cleanup operation. Once the protest ended, the CCP did everything in their power to keep the news inside of China. Reporters and journalists were arrested for even mentioning Tiananmen Square. This photo was taken moments before the photographer was detained. Many citizens who marched in the protest escaped to Taiwan and the United States because the CCP was cracking down on leaders in the protest. One woman, Chai Ling, who marched on June 4th, had to escape to America. From there, she did many interviews and wrote a couple books. It's because of people like her that we know as much as we do about that day. The days following, the wounded were tended to, the military closed off Tiananmen Square, and the world would come together to mourn for those who were silenced. The students at Peking University returned to their schooling despite a quick military search on June 6th. Their morale was substantially improved, but with the cost of 3,000 lives. The Chinese police force became worried that another protest would happen. After all, they had been publicly harassed and saw all the same horrors that the protesters did. Until further notice, martial law was still in play. However, with the change that the soldiers were required to be friendly with the people. In more recent years, Tiananmen Square memorials have been emerging from the need to remember. Human rights lawyer and activist Xiao Hangteng, for the last few years, has helped to organize a peaceful annual remembrance of the Tiananmen Square protests. In 2021, after she posted on social media to encourage people to light candles at home, she was imprisoned in Hong Kong. So did the government hear their pleas? Well, it's hard to elaborate on exactly what changed, but to summarize, the government subtly became more lenient on free speech and slowly replaced more traditional leaders with ones that roughly shared the people's political standpoint. These protests certainly proved that China was not afraid to put their foot down when times called. Previously in time, the government manipulation was all masked behind the concept of moving towards a better future. After the protests, it was clear that the CCP had more malicious influence than believed. This is not to say that the government wasn't fazed by the actions of the students. China was backed into a corner and forced to change their ways in a state of panic and distress. But we can easily see how China was putting on a tough guy act in order to prove cultural evolution to the world. The Cold War's conclusion in 1991 could have also been a big reason for why China loosened their grip on the people, as during that time, both the Soviets and the US were pushing to gain political dominance. Before Tiananmen Square, the world sort of saw China as the place you don't want to be. These protests sort of humanized the people of China. As a result, the world strived for their human rights and tried to push democracy onto China.
I'll tell you, it was very moving because all of us have seen the bravery and the determination of the students and the workers, seen their commitment to peaceful protest, and that image, I think, is going to be with us for a long time.
China is still technically a communist country, and it will most likely stay that way for decades to come. Though, if it wasn't for these very protests, those brave students might still be living in poverty and isolation. They taught us that when you've been dealt a bad hand, you have the power to make a change. Unfortunately, this lesson was taught through bloodshed and violence, but despite and because of the tragedy, we must never forget the protests of June 4th, 1989.